As you know, we're here today to honor General Wesley Clark on the occasion of the publication of his book, Waging Modern War. After this press conference, we will have a book signing and reception, and then General Clark will speak and answer questions. General Wesley Clark is a hero to Albanians throughout the world. And he's a hero because of the critical role that he played as NATO's Supreme Commander in Europe in finally putting a stop to 10 years of Slobodan Milosevic's genocidal march across Southeast Europe. As you know, a march that culminated in the deaths of thousands of Kosovar Albanians and the expulsion of close to 1 million. Albanian Americans are grateful to General Clark, especially because he continues to be a voice for U.S. leadership to prevent the revival of the nightmarish vision of Slobodan Milosevic, a nightmarish vision of ethnically cleansed mini-states throughout Europe. And he continues to be a voice for bringing a just and lasting peace to the Balkans, a democratic, peaceful, and secure Balkans. And with that, I want to introduce General Clark. Please, when you begin, give your name and state your press affiliation. Thank you. General Clark.
Well, I'm very happy to be here, ladies and gentlemen. I've just completed 1 year as a retired Army officer, and it's been a good year. I spent much of the year working on this book, which was an effort to promote greater public understanding of the dangers, the importance, the significance of what NATO and the United States were attempting to achieve in the Balkans. My goal was to take it away from being a partisan issue and help make it more a national and international issue. I think it represents, NATO's actions represented an historic watershed that we've seen continued by the dramatic events of recent days in which Slobodan Milosevic is now in The Hague awaiting his arraignment tomorrow morning. And so I think that all of that and more has stemmed from NATO's leadership, NATO's acceptance of its responsibilities in this campaign to stop Serb ethnic cleansing. And with that, I'll be happy to take your questions. Yes, sir.
How much of a struggle was it to bring Slobodan Milosevic to justice?
Well, I think it started with some ambivalence because he was a factor in helping us secure an end to the fighting in Bosnia. And so there were some people who believed he could be dealt with and even relied upon. It was known that he was an unsavory character, that he may have been behind some of the Serb activities, but on the other hand, that he wanted peace, and it seemed that that was the expeditious path to take at the time. I had reservations at the time, even then, in dealing with Milosevic, as I explained to Ambassador Holbrook, because it seemed to me that we were still dealing with a man who was essentially an evil force in the region. When I went to the region in 1997 and discovered the status of implementation of the Dayton Accords, I recognized again the malign influence of Slobodan Milosevic. I had many meetings with him. I would occasionally talk to him on the telephone, and ultimately, when I saw the design that he had in mind for Kosovo, I had to take measures to alert Western leaders to the dangers. And his own actions in the face of NATO warnings are what brought him down.
Since you dealt with him personally, what kind of person did you find him to be?
Well, he's very bright. He speaks English. He considers himself a wise, worldly, crafty leader. He believes he's acting with the best interests of Serb people. He doesn't consider himself personally prejudiced against other ethnic groups. As he told me on 2 occasions, many of his best friends were Muslims. So, on the other hand, he is a man who would stop at nothing to achieve his aims. And that included, his actions included murder. And even larger, I believe, the the actions directed against whole groups of populations, which the United Nations has branded crimes against humanity. Yes, sir.
Yusuf Haidisi with the newspaper Civic. General Clark, in a recent hearing in Washington, who said that the Albanians in Kosovo will not feel secure until they are independent. How realistic do you think that idea is for Kosovo to become independent?
Well, that's a slight misstatement of what I said. What I said is that they have feelings that they would need independence to be secure. I think it's up to the international community to undertake a process that lets the Albanian community in Kosovo educate itself and make an informed decision as to the best course of events to follow, whether it is independence or some form of autonomy within a broader Yugoslavia. So I think those decisions remain to be made. But I acknowledge the strong preference of all of the Kosovar Albanians for independence right now, based on what they know. And I think it's a very natural thing.
One other thing, in your book, it was quite surprising for a lot of people to find out that the political prisoners that were taken out of Kosovo during the bombing and sent to Serbia were taken out of the list to negotiate with the Serb generals by the Pentagon. Was that surprising to you? And would have been possible for that point to stay in that agreement and still reach an agreement?
I believed it was a mistake to take it out. I told them at the time it was a mistake, and I was overruled.
Do you think that the administration has done enough to release all the prisoners now?
Well, I think it was a very, very important issue, and I think it remains an important issue. Whether they're prisoners or whether they're simply missing remains to be determined. I think every one of these people should be accounted for on all sides, not only Albanians, but also all the Serbs. All of this information and all of these tragedies need to be opened up in this region, so public understanding can be informed by the truth. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Mimoza Ushitian from newspaper Review. General, in your book you have write about the one misunderstanding that you have in the first key for Sir Mike Jackson about the Russian troops they entered in the airport of Pristina. Can you tell us about which was the reason that the General Jackson he didn't finish your decision that you said that to take kind of action to stop the Russian troops to enter in the airport of Pristina? Can you elaborate it a little bit?
It's very difficult for me to elaborate on General Jackson's motives, other than what I've said in the book. I know what he said, what was behind them, and how he implemented that, I don't know. We'll probably have to wait for General Jackson's book. I believe that it was necessary to take strong action so that NATO, and NATO only, would have the deciding voice in which forces went where. Ultimately, NATO did have a deciding voice in that, and we prevented the Russians from having their own independent sector, and I think that was the right thing to do under the circumstances. As you know, there was, for a long time, a confrontation in the region southwest of Pristina, where the Russians wanted to occupy an area and never quite got into the area due to the strong objections of the local populace, who felt that Russian mercenaries had been fighting with the Serbs and had participated in ethnic cleansing in the area. I drove through that region many times. I looked at the UN investigators as they were finding mass grave sites, and I understood the feelings of the local populace. So I think that ultimately NATO did the right thing at the operational level. There are some in Eastern Europe who suggest that Russia took the measure of NATO in this action, and this was one of their considerations that later gave them the idea that they could go into Chechnya and take action there with impunity.
May I continue?
Is this a follow-up? Okay, one follow-up now. I'll go
It's
to
not
this
follow,
issue.
it's a new question.
Okay, let me come back to you,
Okay,
please. Yes, sir.
thanks.
General, can you tell us how obstructive was the work of nations that were in the NATO alliance during the bombing toward you, during the bombing?
Well, as I said, the greatest difficulties I had really were with the Pentagon. And the reason was that there were those in the Pentagon who didn't want to attack the Serb forces on the ground the way I wanted to attack them. I believe that the Milosevic's forces that were doing the ethnic cleansing in Kosovo were actually a center of gravity, so to speak. We call it a center of gravity because it was so important to Milosevic that I believe if you destroyed these forces, you would have ended his campaign, even if you had seriously attacked these forces. But as it turned out, this was very difficult to do. The airmen weren't quite trained and ready to do it. The Pentagon did not want to approve the use of the Apaches to augment the jets, and so I was never satisfied that we'd done enough to strike and take out the Serb ground forces. And that was really the greatest problem I had during the campaign. It was not the European nations. Question here.
There are some who are saying that, Voice of America, Albanian service, there are some who say that proving Milosevic case is very difficult because of some missing link in the chain of command. Now, you've been a NATO commander and you must know a lot about intelligence gathering in the NATO. Do you think that this is the case, that the case will be hard to prove? I mean, given that NATO had so many communication satellite and other channels from which to gather information?
Well, 3 points. First, I do believe that the precedent in war crimes trials is that the person who is in command is presumed to be knowledgeable, even if it cannot be explicitly proven. And this was the standard that was used against the Japanese general who was found guilty after World War II in the war crimes tribunals. He was found guilty of allowing his subordinates to take action, even though it was never proved that he had ordered such an action. And so the only question here will be, did Milosevic have any authority over the armed forces? And I think there's adequate information available to indicate that he did. Milosevic was serving as a lieutenant in the Serb military. He was an artillery officer, forward observer, as I recall. Later, he told me that he'd reached the rank of major in the Serb military reserve. He'd been to their staff college. He knew how the military was organized. And so he had specific military knowledge. He had commanders at his fingertips. I recall one point in the Dayton negotiations in shuttle diplomacy when Ambassador Holbrooke asked for us to receive guaranteed safe passage into Sarajevo. Milosevic said, "Get me Mladic on the phone," and within 2 minutes he was talking to Mladic. So I think he was very much inside the chain of command, and I think there's adequate information beyond what I've already discussed to show that. I think nations will have to cooperate in making such information available.
And would you be willing to go to The Hague to testify?
Of course. Let's see.
Yeah.
Back to you for a follow-up or another question.
Thanks. General, talking about the situation in Macedonia, do you think that in Macedonia will achieve any solution without participation of NLA guys in the negotiations?
Well, I think that the Albanian politicians, not the NLA, but the Albanian politicians, well represent now the sentiments of the Albanian community. As I have read the figures, over 100,000 Albanians, Macedonian Albanians, have now left Macedonia. And 70,000 apparently are living in Kosovo with families and friends. And so it's a very difficult and dangerous situation. I think what we have to do is we have to maintain the territorial integrity of the government of the country of Macedonia. No divisions, no zones, no breakups, no ethnic separations in there. And we have to establish a condition in which the rights of the Albanians as a minority are fully and totally accepted and supported within the framework. And that means Albanian participation in all the institutions of government, Albanians in the police force and the military and so forth. It probably can't be done overnight, but it is a program that has to achieve success. Macedonia was the model country of the Balkans. It's the only country of the 5 that came out of Yugoslavia, its breakup thus far, that's gotten its independence without a fight. And it was a remarkable democracy. The United States had troops there from 1993 on. We strongly supported the government as a multi-ethnic democracy, and that's the way we'd like to see it. So we also don't believe that the conditions there warranted the initiation of conflict. We believe that the rights of Albanians could have been achieved by other means. So we don't support fighting. Let's go to you.
General, New York Times reported, I believe, during the Bosnian War that the top secret service, Serb secret service person escaped to Netherlands, I believe, with documents implementing the entire leadership in Serbia. In your opinion, is West, including USA, going to open secret service vaults?
I believe that governments will do their very best to provide full information to enable the prosecution of Slobodan Milosevic. I do. Yes, sir.
General Clark, during the war, you had contact either through intermediary or maybe even directly with the KLA in Kosovo. Do you think that it's a good idea for the international community to completely stay away from the NLA, since these guys are actually the people who are fighting? And many people believe now, including your friend Walker, William Walker, think that this is not a good idea. We should actually sit down and talk to the NLA. Do you support that idea?
Well, I believe that people have talked to the NLA. In fact, isn't that what Robert Froelich did, is he did talk to the NLA. But I think as a matter of principle, just as during the war we stayed away from the KLA, I had no direct contact with KLA on a routine basis. I did meet Hashim Thaci one time, and that was it. And I talked to him before the war. And he asked me before the war, about 3 or 4 days before the bombing began, he says, "What do you expect of us?" And I said only one thing: just get out of the way and stay alive. Because I think in that case, it wasn't appropriate to work with the KLA, and we didn't. I think in this case, what's important is that the fighting stop as rapidly as right now. Turn that fighting off. Let's get NATO in there. NATO's agreed to go in on the ground. And then I think the Albanian community can rightly insist on a full and effective program for implementation of broader rights for Albanian Macedonia. Yes, sir.
What was the level of labor of KLA during the bombing toward helping NATO achieve the goal?
Well, in fact, what I did is took advantage of the KLA efforts. We knew, for example, early on we heard that the KLA was going to be destroyed in the first. Milosevic believed he was going to destroy the KLA in 5 to 7 days. He said 5 days. His military said, well, 7 days, just to be sure. Of course, they didn't. But then, a week into the campaign, 2 weeks into the campaign, we began to receive information that the KLA was about to be destroyed. Its large units were breaking up, and it was unable to offer effective resistance. But in fact, as is so often the case when there are determined people who are fighting, it's very difficult to destroy a group like that. And I noticed that the KLA held a corridor open through northeast Albania toward the town of, I think it was Junik. And we continued to watch that area because as the Serbs reacted against the corridor, then we were able to bring in aircraft to attack the Serb positions. There was a small village called, I think, Kosare, where unfortunately we struck a number of the KLA people who were in there on the ground as we were trying to hit the Serbs. It's a terrible misfortune of the fighting that those things happen. But we did try to take advantage of the courage and determination that the KLA showed. But there was no direct coordination with the KLA, at least certainly not by my headquarters. I got reports of what they were intending to do, and I worried about it every day because I knew that they were not trained and equipped to really stand up and fight head-to-head against Serb forces.
In Washington, and when you went to Washington, NATO meeting, and you looked, as you said in your book, you looked at your leadership there, and they gave you a full shoulder. Did you have second thoughts there?
Never had any second thoughts. I knew what we were doing was the right thing to do. And let's see, I've got another question. Let me go to this gentleman here, and then we'll go back around.
Canmore News 12 Westchester. I wanted to ask, what is it about the Westchester area that made you decide to promote your book here?
I was invited. It's a wonderful area. And I'm, you know, when people are interested in the book, I'm happy to come and talk about it because I think that what NATO did there was historic, and I think people need to recognize it and appreciate it. In this case, the NATO operation was a success. We achieved all of our conditions. There was a ceasefire. The Serb police, paramilitary, and military forces were pulled back. A NATO-led force entered. We had the largest spontaneous return of refugees and displaced people, as the Kosovar Albanians, some almost 900,000 who were in Albania and Macedonia returned home. Another 500,000 who've been living in the forests came back to their homes and villages, all in a space of 3 to 4 weeks. It was a remarkable testimony to NATO's success. We should have celebrated that success. But because we couldn't call it a war, we couldn't call it a victory. So there was no victory parade down Fifth Avenue, as in the case of Desert Storm. And the pilots, the brave men and women who flew those aircraft, weren't called in and publicly idolized. Instead, we went about the next task, which was to put KFOR on the ground and try to establish order and build a foundation for democracy and so forth.
General, may I add to that? Having been the congressman from Westchester County, I can assure you that Westchester County is a very multi-ethnic community, as you know.
That's good, guy.
Especially Yonkers, and you have thousands of Albanian American families now in Westchester County, and the home of the Albanian American Civic League is in Oslo. So there's a lot about Westchester that converges tonight with
That's
General
good.
Wesley Clark.
Talk to you later and get you on camera.
All right,
As a follow-up to a previous question here, do you believe that there is a similarity between the KLA and the NLA in the sense that NATO ultimately will recognize NLA like they did with the KLA?
I don't think that's going to happen in this case. I don't think that's going to happen because although the government of Macedonia didn't go as far as we would have liked in assuring the rights of its Albanian minority, nevertheless, they were a legally constituted, democratically elected government with an Albanian participation in the government. So we can't justify the use of force, which was initiated by the NLA. And I don't think anything's going to change that. I think it's regrettable. I think we've done hundreds of thousands, perhaps tens of millions of dollars worth of damage to homes and communities, mostly Albanian homes and communities in Macedonia. And I don't know who's going to repair that. And I worry about the future. I wish it hadn't happened. I wish we could have gotten a sense of the issue that had more international recognition before the fighting began. So I think there'll be a concerted effort on the part of most nations not to recognize the NLA. You know, in the case of the KLA, we transformed it. We did not recognize it. And of course, I met with Daci and Herod and I and many others, but we basically said that it could not remain as that kind of an organization. It became the Kosovo Protective Force and a demilitarized organization at that.
We have time.
One
I'm
more,
sorry
I
for
promise
just
I
one
won't.
more question.
Okay, we'll make this the last question.
You were the commander who led NATO through obviously the first war ever. Until then, we didn't know whether NATO actually works. We had theories, but in reality, it's never went to war. You won that war, despite the fact that you said it was not a victory. Were you surprised when you were pulled out of your position beforehand, 3 months?
Yes, I was. Certainly.
What do you think was the real reason for that?
Oh, I've explained it in my book, and I can't go beyond that. I have no idea what people might have had in mind. I know there were frictions with the Pentagon, but there are always frictions in warfare. I mean, the myth of a monolithic command structure, it's never like that. In any operation, when lives are at stake and the future of nations is at stake, small issues become extraordinarily important. And the issues are fought out in internal confrontations, always. But I was surprised that it became personal the way it did. thank you all very much, and I look forward to talking to you.
I want to make one concluding comment, and
Say something. The general will be here for a couple of hours signing books, and he's going to be making a statement, I guess, at around 8 o'clock to the Albanian American
It's 7
community.
o'clock.
Actually, 7 o'clock it begins, 7 to 8. But I wanted to say something about General Wesley Clark, because I came to know him early on when Shirley and I were in Washington, and we were trying to get the interest of the U.S. government to do something to intervene so that we could stop the genocidal war of Slobodan Milosevic. It became obvious that General Wesley Clark was someone who had an independent mind, who wanted to do things the right way, and Albanian people have come to respect him as their hero. Before the press leaves, we wanted to give you this award, General, because we're going to give it later, but this is something that we believe is very precious. This is made in the town of Cloyes. For those who are not Albanian, Cloyes is where the great general, George Kastriati, known as Iskander Bey, fought off the onslaught of the Ottoman Turks for 26 years. It was this general that saved the rest of Europe, including Italy, Hungary, and Austria. That's why they have his statue right in their major squares, from the Ottoman Turks. But unfortunately, after 26 years, he died, and Albania was overrun. And this statue was made by an artist in Cloyes from a block of alabaster that comes from the mountains there in Cloyes. And we are going to present this tonight to General Wesley Clark because he has captured the spirit, the heart, the imagination of the Albanian people as well as the world. And we believe that it's in that spirit we give this award on a special day for the Albanian people. This is July 2nd. This is the day, 11 years ago, that the Albanians applied for independence, having put a referendum and the international law to the Badminton Commission, and it wasn't recognized. Croatia was recognized, Slovenia, Bosnia, and Macedonia, but not Kosovo. So this is a day that's very special to the Albanian people, and we wanted to commemorate it by presenting you the Albanian American Civic League's annual Balkan Peace Award. We hope in the future, we've discussed this with General Clark, that we can come together and do this in such a way that every year this can be presented in his name, but we haven't yet had the opportunity to discuss that. So this year, for you, it's the Albanian American Civic League's Balkan Peace Award, and we'd like you to have this.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Yes, my pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All right, well, thank you very
all
much.
for coming.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to
For
go in.
the, and for the food. And by the way, if you haven't had, has the food going around here? I hope you've had some food. If not, and there's some drinks. But let me just show you something. The American Civic League. Don't forget, when I left Congress in January 1989, a group of Albanians came to me and said, you know, we need a strong voice still, even though you're not in Congress. What do we do? I says, well, let's look what our Jewish brothers and sisters did. They formed a lobby. That's how they got Israel recognized in 1947 when President Truman became their friend, and then everybody else recognized, right? That's the way it works. So we formed this lobby. Here are some of the thousands of pictures. I picked the best ones of what we did in the 12 years. In fact, you'll see General Wesley Clark here. We met with him last year to talk about the problems in Kosovo. Now, you should have this as a memento, okay? But I wish I could give it to you for nothing. I can't do that. But I am sure that you like this evening so much that you're not going to walk out of here without this. And that you're going to at least consider paying a suggested contribution of $20, but if you don't think it's worth 20, give 10. If you can't afford 10 and you only can afford 5, give 5. But do me a favor, don't walk out of here. Now, you know that General Clark is like family to us, right? Isn't family important for the Albanian people? Now, when you deal with family, we can mention the first name. Wesley! 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 Do I need it? No, give me the mic here. I don't think we need to go down there. Just take it off. I think you can move. Can you move the podium? No, I guess you need it close. Just move it close. You don't need the podium. It's fine. Just put this thing down here. It's great. I'm going to get into the hotel business. I think I know how this works now.
Thank you, Joe. I need the help. Too late.
No, John Buchai, you and your family are doing a wonderful job. I hear such good things about the weddings. You know, he did this at the cost tonight just to accommodate General Clark, and let's give a hand to the Buchai family for Victor Buchai, and to Christina Buchai. Thank you very much. Thank you. I wanted to begin by presenting something to General Clark, and I want to tell you how I came upon this, because the story will make you proud as it made me proud. This was sitting in our bedroom, and I took it to give it to General Clark tonight, because I'm going to get another one. But this is made for me by an artist in Cloyes. This is made from a block of Albanian alabaster. Imagine the artists we have, that they can take a block of alabaster, a square, and make this beautiful shaponia, this eagle, in Albanian shaponia, this beautiful shaponia. Isn't this wonderful? Okay. This really, I think, epitomizes the greatness of Albanians in so many ways, that someone could have the patience to sit down, and Lord knows how long it took to take a piece of stone like this, but they did it. And I'm going to call this gentleman again and have him start making more and more, because there's no question in my mind that this is an award that we're going to give out every year. But the first recipient of this award, and for tonight we're calling it the Albanian American Civic League Balkan Peace Award. We're giving it out in your name, and we're going to have an inscription put on for the general, and this will be hopefully in an honored place in your office or your home in Arkansas. We don't know where, but we're just honored that we could have this, the privilege of giving him this beautiful object that represents the spirit of the Albanian people. Okay?
Joe, thank you very much. What I'd like to do is just talk for a few minutes, and then we're going to take some questions and talk some more. First of all, let me thank you all for coming tonight. You just make me feel wonderful. I feel like part of your great family. Thank you. Thank you also for all you are doing to help your family members and all the other people in Kosovo who are struggling and working to bring freedom and democracy and westernization to that land. Thank you for your generosity for people abroad. You know, our nation is a nation that came from everywhere else. People came to America because they wanted to be here. They left behind their families, their friends. My grandfather came from a place in Belarus called Minsk over 100 years ago. He came to Chicago with his brother. He brought his fiancée and her younger sister. And so today I have 100 cousins. All of us came from abroad, and I feel a special kinship with you all who have recently become Americans, are part of this country, and are still reaching out your hands in support to people in your homeland. Thank you for being great Americans and great human beings. Now I have to tell you, I always knew where Albania was on the map. I did. We knew that it was under the protection of Red China. It was. We knew that if you were an American in the 1960s and 70s, you didn't dare go there. We all knew who John Belushi was. We knew he was an Albanian. And so we were all disposed to like Albanians and want to go there. So I can't tell you how happy we were at the end of the Cold War when Albania moved to become part of the West. Still, I hadn't gone to Albania. My first trip there was the summer of 1998. But I had studied about Albania, and I had learned about the problem of Kosovo. We talked about it many times during the Dayton negotiations. In 1995, we knew that Milosevic had to release his iron grip on Kosovo, but he wouldn't discuss it. The most we could ever get was an American embassy information center in Pristina. No more. In early March of 1998, I went down to Macedonia to visit the 350 American soldiers who were part of the UN Preventive Deployment Force. When I landed, the American ambassador said, "You have to go see President Gligorov right away." I went in to see the president. It was late on a Saturday afternoon. He was there with two of his ministers. And the American ambassador and I joined the conversation. And President Gligorov told me he was worried about what was happening in Kosovo. He said the Serb police had just massacred the Jashari family, 60 people. He said, "You can't treat people that way." He said, especially Albanian people. He said, "There will be war." And he said that Milosevic will pretend to negotiate, but really he only understands the threat of military force. I carried that message back to Washington. But some people in Washington did not want to hear it. During the summer of 1998, I worked to try to create a NATO threat to restrain Milosevic. I remember calling him on the 25th of June. Ambassador Richard Holbrooke was there. Holbrooke had met with Rugova. He was meeting with Milosevic. He was traveling to the village of Cluj, which at that time was considered the most, he said, Holbrooke said, was the most dangerous place in Europe. And he asked me to call Milosevic and make sure Milosevic knew he was in danger. So I called Milosevic. Milosevic was very cordial on the telephone. He invited me to come to Serbia. Please come and ride horses at Karađorđevo. Please, I can play golf. Oh yes, thank you, Mr. President. I said, but Mr. President, what we don't want you to do is to attack your own people. And he said to me, he said, General Clark, he says, these are all my own people. They're all citizens of our country. And I just want them to live together in peace, he said, despite your threats. My NATO threats. Well, I had many hours of dealing with Milosevic, and I knew what a liar he was. And the next day, after Holbrooke had left, he attacked with his military and paramilitary Cluj. And through the summer of 1998, he conducted a campaign of ethnic cleansing in the villages in Drenica. NATO Secretary General Solana called it a village a day keeps NATO away, because Milosevic knew that as long as he only attacked one or two villages a day, he could escape the wrath of NATO. But we called him on the carpet. We didn't let him escape NATO attention. And after Ambassador Holbrooke did the negotiations in early October that resulted in the creation of the Kosovo Verification Mission, I realized that Milosevic had not committed himself to withdraw forces. So with Secretary General Javier Solana and General Naumann, we took a trip to Belgrade. And we talked to Milosevic, and he got very angry. I went back alone so I could talk to him one man on another. I said, Mr. President, if you don't pull those forces back out of the field, we're going to bomb you. And of course, here he was, the president of a country in his own palace. And here am I, just an American general, a man he's known for 5 years, threatening him. So he shrugged his shoulders and he said, I think there's a term in Serbian, it's called INA. And he just said, well, General Clark, he said, NATO must do what it must do. I said, well, Mr. President, get real. You don't want to be bombed by NATO. He said, no, you're right. So we used the threat, we held off the conflict until the 15th of January, when Ambassador Bill Walker called me and said, Ambassador Bill Walker was in Pristina as the head of the Kosovo Verification Mission. He was looking at the trench going up the hill from Raychok. And he said, Wes, he said, I've seen massacres. I know what a massacre looks like. And he said, I'm looking at a massacre. He said, these people are not fighters, they're farmers. He said, I recognize the boots they're wearing, I'm looking at the calluses on their hands. These are people of every age. They've been shot at close range. The clothes they were wearing are the clothes they were shot in. They haven't been rearranged. This is a terrible tragedy. And I knew at that moment that we were going to go to war to stop the Serbs in Kosovo. It was only a question of what it took. Many people have asked me what the worst night of the war was, and they talk about the bombing of the Chinese embassy. But you know, that wasn't the worst night of the war for me or for any of the men and women who flew. There were two really bad times in the war. The first had to do with Albanian civilians who were killed in the air attacks. And all I want to tell you right now is how terribly sorry all of us in NATO were for their casualties.
Oh, we know that. We know it.
But it was a terrible thing, and that was the worst night of the war. There was a place called, I think, Carissa, and we had watched it, and we knew this farmhouse was a Serb police station. We saw the Serb vehicles there. And unfortunately, that night it was used to imprison Albanian civilians. And the other bad time in the war was when the KLA was attacking over Mount Pastrick. Because I know there's some people here who fought in that battle from the Atlantic Brigade. And I know that you guys are very proud of what you did there. But I knew what the Serbs had waiting for you. And I knew how little I could do to help. And I worried about that a lot. Thank God it worked out okay. You accomplished the mission, and we accomplished our mission to help you. And Milosevic recognized that he was facing inevitable defeat. And so he gave in to all of NATO's conditions. He called a ceasefire. He pulled all his forces and his thugs back out. NATO went in and we had the largest spontaneous return of refugees in Europe since World War II. And you know, I knew this was going to happen because I talked to the Albanian refugees. UN officials said, oh no, you have to slow them down, there might be mines. I said, you can't slow these people down. They're going to their homes. I went in early. I think the 17th, 18th of June was my first trip into Kosovo. I went in with the Secretary of Defense. We went up the road. We stopped in villages and cities, and we were just surrounded by people. I think he had no idea what the incredibly powerful emotions were. You see, for some of the people in the United States, the NATO effort was, I hate to say it, but it was more of a distraction. They didn't understand. But for me, it was a passion. We were dealing with a man whom I believe is a mass murderer, and that's Slobodan Milosevic. And he told me in January of 1999 that Kosovo was more important than his head. And so I knew that when we went after him in Kosovo, he would lose his head. We never could get the approval to make an official objective the ending of Milosevic. We knew that was beyond what we could accomplish with air power alone, immediately. But we also knew that with the results that we achieved, and with the tremendous courage and spirit of the people of Kosovo, that Milosevic was finished. And he is. And he's in The Hague today. Six months ago, I was in Houston. I was speaking to a group, and afterwards two Albanian men came up to me. And one of them stood very tall and straight, and he said, I am Albanian. He said, and we are 300 strong in this community today. And he was very proud of himself. And he said, he put his arm around the man next to him, he says, and my friend is from Bujanovac, and he's going home to fight for his home. And I said, oh, but does he have to fight? He said, yes, he must fight. I said, but why does he have to fight? He said, because there are Serbs. I said, but aren't you an American citizen? He said, yes, for 5 years. I said, so let me ask you a question. I said, if a Serb moved in next door to you, could you be kind to him, treat him as a neighbor, and become friends with him even though he was a Serb? He thought about this question. And finally, he gave me what he thought I wanted to hear. He said, of course not. I understood his passion, and I understood his love for his country, and I understood why he felt the way he did. But now I have to tell you how I feel about things. Because what I was fighting for was not to right the wrongs of the 19th century, but try to set in place a framework for the 21st century. Somehow, everyone in the region has to get along without changing borders, without changing boundaries, without forcing people to leave their homes or the graves of their ancestors, without requiring them to change the language they speak. But somehow, all get along together. Because I think the Euro-Atlantic community, where we live in this country, we're all Americans. We should all be in this together, whether we live on this side of the Atlantic or that side of the Atlantic. So I want to tell you, I'm very, very proud to be with you tonight. I'm very proud of the spirit and the courage, the patriotism shown by the Albanian American community. I feel very, very honored the way you've welcomed me and taken me into your hearts. And I thank you for that.
Please respect the request for not smoking in here, because some of us have some allergies and it's not a big enough room for so many people. You know, as General Clark recognized, there are people here in this room that actually went to Kosovo to fight, right? And I'd like to let them stand up. I want to see who those people were that went to Kosovo to fight. Because they did fight and try to defend their families and freedom there. It's important that you do that. Now on this great day for Albanian freedom, where Kosovo did declare its independence, and hopefully it will be recognized in an appropriate time frame, hopefully soon, but obviously Albanians have to show the world that they can govern themselves, and that's what the elections in Kosovo are all about in November. But I'd like us on this day, you know, that is only 2 days away from the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America. Here's July 2nd and July 4th. Let us have a moment of silence for all those who died for freedom here in America and in the Balkans, the Albanians who died for many centuries so that we could be here today. Thank you. Yes. With that, I think you're ready for questions. You know, so many people have come to me tonight and say we want to give something to the general. I said, well, you know, there's only so much time to have presentations and all, but at the end, you know, after this questions and answer period is over, if you have something you really want to present to the general, I'm not going to prevent you from doing that. You stand up at the end and do that. But right now, let's have questions, and keep the questions brief. Don't make them long statements, because we like to hear what he has to say about a lot of things. So with that, let me give you the mic, and you can recognize who you want.
Okay, the man with the 3 books. You have to speak loudly because people won't be able to hear you.
Why don't you come up here and answer what you're going for? So that we can get the question with so many TVs.
General Clark, thank you very much for everything which you did for Albanians from Kosovo. I have one question. We know very good the situation when the Russians came here from the back in Kosovo. We have some information that you ordered General Jackson to hit Russians. He didn't do that. I think he wasn't able for that post which he has, because he was so old. And can you tell us something more about that? It was really order to hit the Russians, or somebody?
Okay, I'm going to tell you the story of Pristina Airport. As the negotiations continued. The French came to me and said, you need a plan to take the airfield, and France volunteers to receive the glory of taking Pristina Airfield. I said, okay, I'll mention that to General Jackson. Jackson didn't want to do this. He said the airfield was too dangerous to occupy and that it wasn't important. And so he turned down the request of the French to lead an air assault. On Thursday afternoon, June 10th, as we concluded the air campaign, I had the expectation that General Jackson's forces would be entering early the next morning. But he called me and he requested a delay and said that the Serbs had come to him and asked a 24-hour delay so they could get their forces back and we wouldn't come in so soon. So since he was the field commander, I said, I'll discuss this with the Secretary General, we'll get back to you. And we supported the field commander. Well, that was the day the Russians came. During the morning of the 11th of June, I ordered Jackson to prepare to launch what we call an air assault to occupy the airfield, in accordance with the original French plan, which he had, even though he didn't want to use it. But he developed many reasons why this was not a good idea. And ultimately, confusion on the ground, plus assurances from the Russian foreign minister, convinced Washington and London not to do anything. And so I was ordered to do nothing. That night, just as I feared, the Russians got to the airfield. The next morning, I was ordered to move as rapidly as possible with Jackson's forces to get to the airfield before the Russians could do anything with it. But it took all day. That night, Washington called and asked me to block the runways on the airfield so the Russians couldn't land reinforcements. And I passed the order to Jackson, but there was a thunderstorm. We were going to fly the Apache helicopters in, set them down on the runways, and block the runways. But Jackson did not want to do this, and there was a storm. I was already planning to go to Kosovo, to Macedonia the next morning to meet with Jackson. So I just said, okay, we'll settle it face to face. I knew I had highest level support in the American channels for blocking the runways. So when I went to confront Jackson, he told me no, he wouldn't do it. I called the British government and said, your commander doesn't want to take my order. And they said, we agree with the commander, and so does Washington. So I called back to Washington. I woke up the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at 3 o'clock in the morning and said, you told me I had your support to do this. Now, the British are saying you don't support it. What's your view? And he says, no, it was a confusion. He said, I knew the British didn't want to do this, but I knew you were being instructed to do it, and I support you. I said, fine. You and the British have to get an agreement because you have a policy problem. And that's really where it was. There was a disagreement between London and Washington. And you see, what decided the outcome was that it was the British who had the soldiers on the ground, not the Americans. The Americans didn't want to lead in the mission. They wanted the British to lead. The Americans didn't want to be in Pristina. They wanted the British to be in Pristina. The Americans didn't want to have the majority of the forces. They wanted the British to have. The Americans didn't want to have the commander. They wanted the British to have the commander. So then the Americans had to live with the British commander's judgment. It's a very important lesson in the use of military power. If you want to lead, you have to put your troops in the lead. And that means if Washington's going to have a voice in helping to solve the problems in Macedonia today, there have to be American soldiers in the lead in that mission.